We hear a lot of perspectives on the Mankind podcast. Inclusion of a guest is not an endorsement of their views, and the opinions expressed here do not always represent the mission or values of the Mankind Project USA.
Hello, everyone. My name is Mun Wah, and this is the Mankind podcast.
Looks like the rain has gone.
G'day, and welcome to another episode of the Mankind Podcast, the show where we break the molds of modern manhood to prove that there's more than just one way to be a man. And also a huge part of this show is to lean in to the conversation topics that are considered taboo or uncomfortable or potentially dangerous. Because we know right now, especially 2021, that there are a lot of conversations that are not being had, that are being fought over, that are being fought on the fringes, that a lot of what's being argued in the media or argued on the streets isn't the root that we should be getting to, isn't the actual essence of where the problems lie in our societies. Whether that's on gender, whether that's on sexuality, whether that's on politics, or whether that's on race. And so today I have a dear friend joining me, new warrior brother, Paul Newell, checking in from New Jersey, who's going to be joining us for the introduction of this episode and my interview with Mun Wah. And so Paul, mate, thanks for being here, brother. Check in, tell us about yourself, and we'll get underway.
Blessings. Well, welcome. Thank you for having me, man. And for those listening, my name is Paul Newell. For my fellow MKP brothers, my name is Makuna Fox Moon. I am a man. I am a personal trainer. I'm a yoga instructor, a Reiki practitioner, yoga practitioner, and the owner of a juice business and several other businesses. And my main mission here is to help men with their health and well-being, especially Black men. As a man that happens to be Black, I've experienced a lot of the traumas and a lot of the scenarios, and I found myself becoming really good at code switching to accommodate others and to help myself be safe. And as a man in my 40s, I have begun to really step into that space and learn from it and help others learn from it, help other Black men learn from the experiences and lessons, and also begin this integration of creating a new paradigm for how we get along as human beings that happen to be different shades and colors and ethnicities. So I'm really excited to be in this intro to discuss this conversation.
Absolutely, man. I'm honored and thankful that you're here. In fact, one of the reasons why you're here is that my conversation with Mun Wah that you listeners are going to hear was incredibly challenging for me. In fact, what it did was expose the racial biases, stereotypes, and assumptions that I currently hold. And what made that challenging is, number one, I judge myself to have a pure, loving, kind nature, character, and just want the best what's for the world. But that doesn't take away from the fact that I also have these racial biases in me. How they got there, I don't know. I don't want to blame upbringing. I don't want to blame environment. I just want to speak to my role and my journey right now and better understanding how I can become an ally for those that are non-white, for those that are different from me. And so I asked Paul to watch the interview and to join me for this introduction, not to save me from my feelings and from the pain and the shame that I felt and still feel from this interview, not to save me, because it's not about me running away from these feelings. It's about me sitting with these feelings. But to come on and witness a conversation that is not being had on a grand scale right now, that not a lot of people know how to have because it feels scary, it feels dangerous. And so, Paul, mate, I'd love to hear your thoughts from the interview and what you experienced watching it.
Absolutely. first off, extending blessings to you and Lee, because the conversation that your listeners are about to hear and experience is truth. It's to me, it's the chrysalis. It's this space of creation that is uncomfortable and is usually free of being in anyone's discussion, right? It's always like, hey, I'm gonna do. It's like a lot of what is happening in society is words. And what my experience of that interview is that this is truth. This is authenticity. This is the work. This is the space of having silence to reflect and think, to breathe, and to be in the discomfort, and also to have space to explore these things. Which, when I heard the interview, I was blown away. There were several parts that I went back and heard again. And, when I heard your experience and knowing you, right, and getting to know you over the past several years, I know your heart. And then like hearing how you went through and how Lee guided you through, how I heard the compassion in his voice and the curiosity in his voice, Brandon. It wasn't about there weren't
assumptions behind it. He wasn't asking questions from assumptions. It was purely from open-ended, tell me,
tell me more.
When you see an African-American man, do you question whether they're educated or not? Like
that, yes.
And I had the answer immediately. I'm like, I don't want to say it though.
and that's the thing, right? Because the things that we think about, right, Brendan, we were talking about this before we got on. The things that I want to say that I resist saying are the things that end up taking a hold over me. And then all of a sudden I'm tiptoeing, I'm walking on eggshells rather than coming out with it. Because let me tell you, when he asked those questions, it's so wild, because when I first meet white people, Brendan, by what they say, their body language, I can tell what they're thinking. Like, in a perfect example is like when he asked about, like, do you think that they're college educated? When I have a white person say to me, like, you speak so well, I'm like, do you think I'm supposed to speak? Like, what do you, like, my question in my head is like, what the hell do you think I'm supposed to speak like? What was in your head about what the voice was and like the conversation? Like, because let's talk about this.
Yeah.
Right. And even like what I loved about Lee, what I learned as a man of color is because I can ask these questions and I can have a tint of like, I know what your thoughts are. Why don't you just be real? And there could be a little bit of aggressiveness to that.
Yeah. Confirmation bias as well.
You see? Yeah. And what I was really taken away from Lee is how he was asking the questions. And again, for me, it's about like, I really want to get curious about this because this is for the benefit of both of us.
Yeah.
Because now we can come to the earth, man. We can get grounded. Let's talk, man. Okay, cool. Now that we have it on the table, let's talk about it. Because you mentioned too, like where it comes from. And as a man that happens to be Black, I can see a lot of the conditioning in programming, in media, in businesses, finances, judicial systems. And I think until we're able to get into these uncomfortable conversations, once those uncomfortable conversations happen, then all of a sudden, other things people will begin to see. It's like the hawk. The hawk can see everything and can fine tune and zero in on a mouse, right, in a field. So when we start to lay these things out, I think that's when the opportunity to really see the bigger picture and move from there opens up, man.
That's my hope. And I have a lot of confidence in that happening. But I can understand how those that are non-white can't really attach a lot of hope to that. Mm-hmm. They don't want to bet their chips in that happening. And so I think that the best way that we can build that bridge is for those that look like me to connect with men, women, non-binary people, to connect with those that are unlike myself. And not to say, and this has been a cool transformation for me, not to say, Paul, help me understand what it means to be Black, which is just putting all of the onus on you.
Yes.
It makes you have to relive all these experiences, but instead to say, Paul, what do you want me to know about your experience?
Listen, you all talking that was another piece that resonated deeply with me. Because in a lot of spaces, especially like, you know, in the Mankind Project spaces, man, going on weekends and like, you know, we have these sections and meetings preparing for these weekends when we had them. And there would be conversations about diversity and race. And there was a lot of that conversation of like, you know, tell me about your experience. And it's like, for what? It got to the point, like at first I was like, okay, yeah, I'll share. And then like that brought on more questions. And that's tiring. It's tiring, man. Yeah. Like I stopped staffing for a lot of that. I was like,
because it's listen, like man. Tokenism, right?
Yeah.
You don't want to be the token that they go, oh, cool, Paul's here. If we get his endorsement, his blessings, we're good.
Yeah, nah, man, nah. And it's wild, man, because the thing that, and what you just said, like, what is it you want me to know? And the thing that I would answer to that is that these spaces are scary for me. And Lee asked you a question, which I appreciate you for being honest. When he said, like, if you were to go into those circles and the ratio was the other way, where you were one of the only white men in a group of men of color, what would that feel like for you? And that's a tough place. I'm thinking from my experiences that could be an uncomfortable place for men that happen to be white, and people that happen to be white. It'll be so. It's like I don't want to think about that. That's like, and that's the place, man. And listen, for people that are listening to this work, look, this work you're about to hear, this is for a select few. I'm being completely honest because, like, Brandon, you know me, I can get Pollyanna. I can be like, yeah, keep hope alive. Yeah. Now, I'm being real here. This is for a select few. Because to go into this work means you're challenging the conditions, you're challenging yourself, you're coming to your edge. You're going to voice things about yourself that you may think will shift people's perspectives of you. And the reality of it is, it will. Because people's perceptions is none of your concern. The work that you get to do to address the conditioning that happens unconsciously and consciously in families, in all in the environment, those are the spaces to tap into. And some people can handle it and some people are unable to. And on whichever side, the listeners, whichever side you're on, if you're the minority, if you're the majority, whatever it is, and whatever side, if you're one of the few, the key thing is to meet people where they are in this conversation. Mm-hmm. And this is another thing I took from what you like, how you two were and how Lee was with you. He met you where you were. You know, I noticed him scale back, even in the beginning. Like, you know, I'm trying to remember the characters in the movie, but like, hey, you know, he said resonated with you. Well, what resonated? Scale back. Let's see where you are. And then go from there rather than me making assumptions, man.
And, you know, I think that's the compassion element that's so necessary in conversations like this. Like, there has to be clarity of intent. What is my intention? Like, am I clear on my intention for having this conversation with you, Paul, right now?
Right.
And then compassion to hear your experience and remove any assumptions or stereotypes or biases that I might be assuming is your experience. And then just to be curious, just let that curiosity lead the conversation. And I honor Mun Wah for that in his approach. And I honor all of those that aren't just calling people out, who haven't developed the language yet, that haven't developed the understanding yet. Because there are those that I judge. And I think what we're talking about here, Paul, is the difference between willingness and wantingness.
Say it again for the people in the back.
Because when we had you and Baradaji on last year during the Black Lives Matter movement to talk about Black Lives Matter, neither of us had any answers.
Right.
And I was definitely coming from that place of help me understand. So I appreciate your patience and grace with my questions. But I remember we came to the conclusion that it's that difference between willingness and wantingness. Do I want to have these conversations? Yes and no, because they're very uncomfortable. But am I willing to stand in the fire with them? And I judge there are a lot of people out there, and possibly a lot of people listening right now, that may not want to. They may not want to face these parts of themselves, perhaps these ugly truths, perhaps have to come to terms with things they've done, said, thought, either recently or in their past. But I believe there are a lot of people that are willing. And if they're given the grace and the patience and the understanding, and it can be met where they are, then I believe we can invite them into the conversation. That's how you create allies, not by saying you narrow-minded asshole.
Wow. Exactly.
Yeah.
And hey, listen, even if, and I want to pause for a second, because like there may be the tendency to say you narrow-minded asshole. And the language around that is like, thank you for saying that. And, you know, the thought that was coming up, since we're being transparent, as I was thinking you were a narrow-minded asshole. It's got to be, I'm a fan of the reciprocal relationship, right? Like this give and flow. So, hey, listen, like I get a lot of people ask, what's your experience? Like, and I love what Mun Wah said was, well, let's hear yours. Let's hear this, because man, that's stripping away the layer, and that's the fire transformation, man. That's beautiful. And again, it may be tough for people, and that's what it is, man. This conversation, especially the language and the compassion, and being free of trying of convicting or convincing someone. Listen, that's a key piece, man. That's a huge piece in this. And wow, yeah, my mind just went somewhere. Yeah, like wow, bananas, man.
I think it also needs to be said that this podcast isn't just for white folk.
No.
That it's about for those that are Black, brown, Asian, the ability to understand and acknowledge the racism between races as well. And that although some of you listening may be a part of a minority, that this is also not just pointing the fingers at white people. This is also being able to turn the fingers inwards and go, well, you know what, where can I own this? And I think Mun Wah does a beautiful job of acknowledging, you know, his mother was murdered by a Black man. And his dad, the narrative in his household from his father was, you can never trust an African-American. And look at the position he's in today. If that doesn't give you hope for transformation.
Yeah, dude, this podcast, man, I shared it on my page because, like, as I was telling you before, I listened to this. I stopped, paused it, went back, reflected on it, listened to a lot. I think, and you bring a great point. Like, this is a great conversation for all people to listen to, especially if you're willing, right, to do the work and pay particular attention to Brandon, just real quick, I just want people, the invitation is to pay attention to the words that Mun Wah uses. Pay attention to the space in between the question and the response. And pay attention, please, to the tone that Mun Wah uses. And I even sense that be the hawk and the observer and hear and see if you can sense the intention from Brandon and from Mun Wah. Because I think this is so multi-layered that I'm really hoping that this gets to a lot of people to hear this. So bless up to you, man, and thank you for stepping in the fire, man. Thank you, brother.
Hey, thank you, man. Thank you for not making the journey easier, right? But making it more enriching and less dangerous. It's not about getting away from discomfort. It's about getting away from the danger level. So for those listening that are about to enter into this episode, honor yourself, honor where you're at. You may not be willing right now. Now's not the time. That's fine. Also, trigger warnings in effect. This may be a triggering interview for you. So if you do find yourself getting triggered, please honor yourself, step back, walk away, come back to this interview another time. But I can tell you, if you're willing to stand in the fire and willing to possibly look at those parts of you that, you know what, the times in your life where you may not have been an ally to those that are different than you are, the moments where you may be complicit to racism, complicit to sexism, just know that you're human. And so long as you're willing, those mistakes, you get a chance to turn them around. So I hope you guys enjoy. Paul, mate, thank you so much for being with us, man. I can't wait to share this space with you again in the future and just planting the seed. For those of you listening at home, I selfishly want you to be able to hear this man's message and this man's voice a lot more. So I want you to co-host the show with me in the future, my friend.
What's up, man? Coming soon. My man, love you, brother. Peace.
Love you too, man. Peace. Guys, good day and welcome to the Mankind podcast for another live recording. And this show is all about breaking the molds of modern manhood to prove that there's more than just one way to be a man. But not only does this podcast center around topics relating to the male psyche, psychology around manhood, boyhood, masculinity, and everything in between, we also like to cover topics that are very important to understanding our role as men in society and the ways in which we can turn up to not just support those that we feel like need support, but to become champions for those of difference and those different to ourselves. And I'm so pleased and honored to be joined by Mun Wah today to talk about one of his most powerful and pertinent films that I've had the fortune to watch and experience, which is The Color of Fear. So, Lee, Mun Wah, you have an incredible amount of experience in conversations around race, around gender, around diversity, and I want you, for those who haven't had a chance, who already know about you, just to introduce yourself to our audience, the work that you're involved in, and what's alive in you these days.
Well, wow, it was done in 1995, kind of hard to believe. And I think that film singularly changed the course of my life. And I think also it didn't help being on Oprah Winfrey, which also then added a phenomenal push into another direction of my life to be not only doing more films on the issues of racism and sexism, but also leaving teaching, which I had done for about 25 years as a special ed teacher, and in San Francisco working with young kids. What I was surprised about was how early in my life that I was, well, I think as a child of color, being Chinese, of Chinese descent, I experienced a phenomenal amount of racism, but also at the same time, a phenomenal amount of indoctrination, how to blend in and leaving my culture behind or behind the door before I walked into any room. So I think that experience really helped. And I think the title, for instance, The Color of Fear, I think that I wrote it because I think there is a great deal of fear around color. And I think fear about talking about it. And I think more particularly fear of white people to talk about racism. There is this statue that is in the Chinese culture that looks like this, which is, I want to hear the truth, but not too much if it gets emotional or angry. I want to hear the truth, but not if I'm responsible. And I think that that's still true today. And I wrote a paper called Say Something America, which is this silence. And I just finished doing another workshop, it was very much like the discussion that we had in The Color of Fear. And I remember somebody said, well, I don't know what it's like to be a Black man. I don't know what it's like to be an Asian man, so I don't know what to say. And that's why I don't say anything. And when I'm on an airplane or something like this, what'll I do if someone's being racist or sexist to somebody? And I said, well, let's propose another scenario, and that is, if that were your child, if that was your son or daughter, if that was your mom or dad, if that was your grandparents, I would guarantee you that you would just jump in, not even thinking about what you're going to say or do. You're just going to jump in there to protect them. And I said that there's somehow whites have adopted this paralysis, this emotional and social and political paralysis of ignorance. In other words, I don't know, what I would do. And I think that there are two reasons. One is a fear of doing something, and then a fear of saying something because there's no model for it. I think that's why The Color of Fear was so profound when it came out in 1995. And I think there were several reasons why. I think that I didn't discover until later. Number one is I think that we dealt with diversity issues having one person at a time, very much like this, filming one person talking, then another person talking. And even Spike Lee did that about the little girls who were bombed in the Birmingham church. Once again, it was one face at a time. And I think that we're used to that. And I think partly because a lot of filmmakers also aren't therapists or do group work. Whereas for myself, I am, and so I did a lot of group work. I particularly did group work rather than individuals because I wanted to show the dynamics, and also to learn how to relate to each other. I think that so oftentimes we talk about, someday, it'd be great if we talk to people of color and talk to a group of white people, but we just talk about it. We read about it. We analyze it. We even study ways of communicating, non-violence communications, so that we won't hurt somebody, but we don't really engage in them. And I think last time I talked to you, Brandon, was about the Black Lives Matter. What I noticed is there were all these protests and everybody comes out, but I didn't see people of color and whites and even people of color with each other talking to each other that they didn't know. They just stood next to each other. And so I think, and also all the national conversations on race were exactly the same way. So I think that's why The Color of Fear is just as relevant today and as novel today as it was then, which is sad to me because I thought that I would create a model to have this conversation. And I think maybe we got lulled into not thinking it was that big of an issue, which I even remembered writing to Oprah Winfrey about the possibility of having me on again. And she said, well, there's no big issue going on today. And so it was like, as long as it wasn't in the news, as long as someone wasn't getting shot, as long as the whole city wasn't burning down, then we weren't going to have it as a big issue. I think it's a lot like, for instance, when we kept having all these SUVs, at one point we were trying to get smaller cars and that were more ecological. And then we just seemed to have an abundance of gas and oil. And then suddenly we just didn't think of having that be a problem again. I think it's very similar in that way, which I think is very sad that we don't really often act unless there's a crisis. And so in The Color of Fear, you also see an African-American man who just lets it rip. And people said, you let him go out of control. And I said, no, he was just simply being passionate. But I think also there's something that the white man says to him, which I think is just as pertinent today. And that he said, I'd be more than willing to talk to you, Victor, but not the way you talk. You scare me. And because of the volume of his voice, which I said was more passionate, which is different than the way white people talk, which is often up here to me. And so what he said was, Victor said, which I think is very profound. He said, I don't want to talk this way, but I do when I feel like my humanity is diminished and trampled upon and trivialized and minimalized and attacked. I have no choice but to stand up for my humanity, for who I am. And I think that that's a really good point, because oftentimes we look at the product of what happens. For instance, at the Kent University, State University, you see a policeman during the riots and the protest against the Vietnam War, and he has a cloth and he's wiping off the blood of a protester. And people all go, well, wow, this is how compassionate of the police officer. But what people don't know in terms of the context is that he's the one who hit her. And so I think it's one of those things where we sometimes forget what was the cause. Where did it come from? So Victor Lewis didn't just get mad like that or get passionate. It's because the white man kept diminishing and blaming him for his plight, to a point where he just said, I've had enough of hearing you just say, why can't we just be brothers? Where it was fascinating, because it was pointed out later on in the film that David, the only friends he really had of color were the people who came into his jewelry store, which he then labeled them as his friends. But his best friend, who was white, says, do you ever go out with them? Do you know where they live? Do you have dinner with them? He goes, well, no. It's only when they come in my shop. And I think what we do is we claim we have like workplace friends, but not necessarily intimate friends. A recent study showed that something like 70% of white people do not have an intimate person of color as a friend. And of those 30 or something percent who do have a person of color who is a friend, they rarely, if ever, talk about racism. And so it doesn't come up. And so what people of color learn, as well as myself, is I guess white people are threatened to talk about it. They don't talk about their own ethnicity. They don't talk about their own privilege. So perhaps it's not safe to talk about it. And as I shared with you in the men's movement, when I brought up racism, it was so amazing to me how I kept getting referrals as a therapist up to that time. And then when I started pointing out racism in these men's group workshop, work conferences and associations that I had, that suddenly I got no referrals for 10 years. And so it's dangerous to bring it up, but no one says, I'm pissed that you talked about this. It just becomes like this silent blacklisting of you, so that you no longer are acceptable. And maybe you even get labeled as a troublemaker. And so, or even when I was growing up, I was taught, don't be like those black people from white people. And so I learned how to be a team player, how to be trustworthy to whites. And I think that you could see that in the film, how David, the white guy, tries to lull us into, why can't we just be friends? Why can't we just be brothers? You sure you aren't making this up? And so that he just is such a phenomenal example of that kind of, keep it nice and I'll still love you. But if you raise your voice, if you bring this up, then I'm having problems with you. Or I stop listening to you.
So there's a lot there. Thank you for setting the scene and for bringing up David in the film. I, before ever watching the film, I had seen the clip that is sampled from the film of Victor speaking of his, not just his experience, but the experience of his people, of his communities, and the animation and the passion that you say that comes out from him. And I haven't met a single person that has watched that and not felt impacted by it. And it's very natural to see David, the white David, in his reaction to that, right? And his very intellectual. He was trying to very understand on an intellectual level Victor's experience, and he was saying a lot of things like, "Well, I feel like you're just creating your reality." Right, you are in charge of your own reality, and Victor's response to that, the anger that came up, the emotions that came out, were really just having not being in a position to ever fully understand his experiences. I got to really see him fight for his humanity in that moment.
Yeah, I think there's several other aspects that are important. Many people, after they see the film, they often point out that Victor is the star of the film, and also quote him a great deal. And I think that it also has a lot to do because of how passionate he became in the film. But I often feel that people don't quote the Asians, the Latinos that are in the film too. And I think that that is also kind of speaks to why we're in the situation with Asians today too.
Yeah.
Is that oftentimes they're invisible, that they seem like they will have arrived, or as David Lee says, who was Asian in Color of Fear, it's almost like people think that we're almost white. And there's a way to which white people used us. Why can't you black people be like the model minority, the Asians, and take a look at how law-abiding they are? However, what's not discussed is like in my film Stolen Ground, where we talked about all the stereotypes that people have of us, of being asexual, unathletic, not leaders, passive, secretive, sneaky. And so all of that is interpreted through white eyes, that if you're not talking, you must be sneaky, you must be underneath, you must be untrustworthy. However, when we become useful is when we're used to go against black people. And so I think that all of the different ethnic groups have been used in that way. Why can't you be like them? And so I think that also that sense of passiveness is why there's all this violence. There is one more aspect to this I want to bring out, and that is that just recently I shared that with friends, is that I don't know about you, but doesn't anybody notice who the people who are beating up the Asian people? They're blacks. There seem to be a majority of blacks. In fact, 4 or 5 major ones have been black people. I had not heard anyone say that. It's just that had been attacked. We have arrested the person who did it. Even when blacks are asking to support the Asian community, I don't hear one single one of them, or even the Asians, pointing out that there is a disparity and a tension between blacks and Asians that have been going on for years, partly perpetuated and primarily perpetuated by white people who started it off. And now we can't even remember how it all began, how British went all over the world talking about being afraid of black people. And at the same time, take a look at the Exclusionary Act, in which we were excluded out of the United States for 10 years. No other group has ever had that, and how we were treated than the Japanese. And so I think that there's a way in which I don't want to get into a place of competition.
Who's got it
of
worse,
oppression. Right? What I did bring out to people recently is that I think is really important, and that is every non-white group in America has been beaten, hung, killed, isolated, put on reservations, internment camps, enslaved, put in chains. I want you to think about that. Every non-white group has had some experience of this in the United States. And in the previous administration, the Trump administration, it was rampant. The white supremacist moves that were made toward anybody who was an underrepresented group or who was not white. And that is still going on today, as we begin to see how blatantly the voting rights and the slew of anti-trans legislation that's crossing this country right now. And so I think that what I want to say to my white counterparts is that I want you to say something. I want you to do something. I don't want you to discuss it. I don't want you to read a book on it. I want you to actually do something. I want you to say something. I want you to stand up to the lies that you keep hearing about people of color on a daily basis. I want the police union to say something. And so that's critical to me. And then also in terms of the Mankind Project, I would have probably become more involved, but it felt overwhelmingly white to me.
Yes.
At that time, and for many years, and perhaps still is, where it has a sprinkling of people of color. But I want these issues of diversity to be normalized, so that it isn't, oh my gosh, I was the first one, but that it's sprinkled throughout the entire hierarchy of the Mankind Project. But I think that that's true of every organization in the United States, is that we're still 10% or 20% at best in any organization, but almost never in the decision-making circle. So I think that's why the color of fear today is just as relevant as it was then, and that we still are not talking about it. but only when there is an issue that comes up. As my son pointed out very well, is that if there was not a virus and you had to be stuck with the TV, would you have been watching these issues, or would you not be turning it off, changing stations, and then going out and just doing other things instead of focusing on this issue? And it was a really good point. And I guess it'll be tested soon when everybody gets well, or starting to get well in the United States. Will civil rights issues still take front hand?
Right. It's definitely this kind of goldfish kind of attention span. It seems like while it's hot, and news and media can stick to it and put it in front of us because it's what people want to know about. But then naturally it's like, well, what's the next thing? What's the next thing? And so I want to circle back to the role that white folk can play in the change, right? This vision of change that I'm sure you very much are fighting for and working towards. And to do that, I want to talk about David in the film. You mentioned that a lot of people see Victor as kind of the protagonist, let's just say, like the main character, but everyone played their role. But the person that I connected to the most was David. Well, there's two Davids there, white David, because the things he was saying were the things that I have been afraid to talk about, right? I have not been comfortable bringing to the table. And I think that he does a great service to the project, right? The weekend for the film, to really bring up a lot of what is sitting on the minds and hearts of white people in relation to their feelings towards non-white folk. And so it was natural in the beginning when I saw him in that clip with Victor, where Victor was sharing his emotions and his passion, to go, oh, well, David's just narrow-minded. He's ignorant. He's naive. He's, if we're talking film's hero's journey, he's the villain in the story. But to see his transformation throughout the film was very touching for me, and clearly very touching for others in the room. Trying to think of the link here, because this is not this is a new topic for me to talk about and one I'm working through.
Yeah, I get that. And I think that I'd like to ask you, when you said that I could identify with David, in what way? What was familiar about David in your own life as a white man?
Yeah.
And the reason why I'm doing that, Brandon, is that because that's the part you left out. And I think people wouldn't catch that. Yeah. But I do this practice in mindfulness called noticing what's missing. So, you didn't elaborate. You just said, oh, there were in so many ways I was like David. Yeah. And so, but I'd like to hear it, because I think that it's rare that a white male that will actually identify and share what those are. And then maybe even the deeper question might be, is Brandon, where did you get those from? And in what ways do you feel like you still practice those?
Yeah. Whew. So the first thing that I related to was him just trying to intellectually comprehend the problem, and then say, well, here's the problem, right? To try and name the problem and say, here's the solution, right? To identify a problem and go, well, let's fix it. If we know the problem, then of course there's got to be a quick solution to it.
So what's familiar about that for you as a white male? This is becoming me interviewing you. Just joking. but this is part of that exchange, isn't it?
Absolutely.
So I want you to notice
the process.
Just for a moment, Brandon, is that, do you see how much thought you're having to give this?
Oh my gosh. So here's the thing. I don't want to look the same that David did in the beginning of that film. It's like, I don't want to be painted with the same stroke. That's the fear, right?
Yeah, I remember in one of my second films, I want to just hear if you hear this part, is that the white male says, if I'm identified any way of being a racist, I'd want to kill myself, he said. That's how intense it came. I would want to kill myself. I think that when you think about that, if I were like David, then what would that mean? And what do you think, what would be the fear if you were like David? What do you think my reaction might be to you too? What do you think that the world's reaction might be to you too? I want you to think about that. Are those the people you're worried about? Is what people will perceive me as? Because I like myself being a liberal, caring, compassionate white guy who works for the Mankind Project, works with the Mankind Project. You know, all of a sudden that image is gone, or maybe it's tarnished.
Yeah. Yeah. I feel fragile.
And then think about how many people that have had in the news that you hear, okay, they're fired, who are white, who say these things, who think these things. So now you see that there's a cost that even if you were to mention these in any way, shape, or form, however unconscious, that there would be a price to be paid when they're, and that's why I'm noticing your hesitation. So I'm going to go back to it because I'm very unrelenting. In that, in what ways are you like David? You said about the part that you go to your head, and I like to also propose to you that part when you said go to your head. What I would like to propose to you that going into your head is trying to make sense of it from your white lens.
Yep. The way that I relate and I feel like David, as he was in the beginning of the film, was this sense that I want all people to experience opportunity, experience joy, that they have access to it, not my current operating system, but has been in me for a long time. And it's very fresh for me, having just watched the film. A lot of these things have come to the surface. So I can either speak to where I'm sitting right now or what's been my operant conditioning up until this point.
So I want to be specific with you, what you gave as an example. In other words, it shouldn't be this way. Everybody should be treated well, etc. Okay.
That's the philosophical.
Yeah, right. Well, it's also a wonderful United Nations speech and concept. All right, that we all have equal rights, equal opportunities, and the right to be happy. Okay, or as David says, why don't you and your people just come together to feel good about yourself? In other words, a lot of solutions, a lot of wrapping up. This is how we can come together, et cetera, which is a very white way of looking at something. When someone tells you that you might be responsible, that a group might be responsible. I remember what Lindsey Graham just said today is there is no systemic racism in America. And in other words, I don't see it, even though he participates and is, but it's like, we're all together, like this illusion, but I just wrap it up. We are really all one people, which has never happened in this country. And however, what would happen if you were to let in that you were responsible? Those who are white are responsible as the benefactors of racism and sexism and homophobia and classism. What would it mean if, in fact, you benefited from all of that? So that if you have to bring it up, is what you don't talk about, what you don't bring up in rooms, so that you may think so because I want it for everybody, but you don't necessarily look at yourselves as being part of the problem, but rather let's all come together. I know you said something to me recently at the last time we talked, was that I have a book where a man forgave his German captors, being Jew. And so that we'd rather look at that book than to stay with the inhumanity of what happened, so that we would look for a forgiveness story, but skip this whole part of the anguish and the hurt and the rage, the devastation and the inhumanity of 6 million people being burned alive, men, women, and children. And so if we go to that story, it's much easier and much more palatable. Yeah. And maybe the deeper question today might be is, would you have joined the Mankind Project if it was 99% people of color and you were one of the very few whites that were in the room? Would you walk into that room and go, damn, it feels good to be here? Or would you go, this is really scary? And so it's easy to invite people of color because you're still the majority, an overwhelming majority. Yeah. And I think that's an important question, isn't it? And it'd be okay for you to say to me, I'd be scared.
Yeah. It's a shitload of work.
Yeah, I'd be self-conscious.
Yeah.
I'd be looking at people wondering what they're thinking of me.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder if they're angry at me. All these things that would go on. And that's a scenario that you don't have to face unless you go to another country.
Yeah.
You decide to immerse yourself.
The roles switch in that circumstance, right?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I feel like there's a ton of fear driving the bus on that front. Mm.
And so I think that as we just take that really profound example, but on a more lighter one, would be is, what are some of your fears? I wrote this paper called 4 Mythologies That White People Carry. And one of those is, I'm afraid I'm going to say the wrong thing and hurt people of color, which I think is a myth, because I don't think that's really the whole story. I think it's afraid that we'll get angry at you, we'll label you, we'll push you away because we think you're a racist. So then you go, oh, it's to protect you, and I think that that's only half the truth. But once again, you see how it masks the more deeper one. Yeah.
And it's this dichotomy of, well, my work has to be about me, but I don't want it to be about me. Like, it's no one else's job to facilitate me, young white dude, through understanding and waking up to my whiteness.
Right.
Right. And am I making it burdensome on those that don't look like me by becoming a part of this process? Because I don't want it to be a sense of, well, help me understand, help me understand your experience. I don't want it to be that way. I want it to be, what do you want me to know?
Well, actually, I think it's a combination of both, but one has to be earned. So I'll give you an example. In other words, another one is, I don't want to leave it up to people of color to educate me. It's not their job. It's important for me to do that. And so, and I also, I need to be quiet and just listen. And so I said, that is so ridiculous, to be honest with you. It's understandable and ridiculous. And I think it's a mythology that was passed on recently, not necessarily one that started off. So in other words, it started off with, so tell me what your experience is. I'd like to know, from white people. And so we told them, and then we got invalidated. We got labeled. For instance, isn't that exactly what Victor does with David? He tells him his experience. Now, one thing that's very profound that most people don't pay attention to in The Color of Fear is that you realize that every single time that Victor shares something, there is no acknowledgement on the part of David about what Victor said. The second thing is that it looks like he's curious by asking a question, but it's one that makes him doubt and question his veracity. So I can't believe it could be happening to you, David, to Victor, that maybe it's something that you're playing a victim, and maybe it's just an imagination that you have. So his question is one that is in fact attacking and placing him into defensiveness. And so hence it escalates. So at no time does he ever ask, tell me what you meant by when the spikes are up and mine lay down. Tell me what that does to you, Victor, when our worlds are different in that way. Tell me how it feels, Victor, that I keep saying these things to force the people of color to prove it really does happen. Tell me, Victor, how it feels when I keep bringing up that white people go through these experiences too. And then what that does. And then I could tell the truth. Do you know how rarely I ever hear that? As profound as the color of fear is, so that I remember what Will Sandoval says in my most recent film to the white guy. Why is it that when I ask you about racism, you tell me what you can't do, but you never tell me what you can do or are willing to do? And then you never ask me any questions about my life, about how traumatic it is and what I have to go through. And then I'm waiting for you to be moved and touched by that story instead of looking too objective. Just recently, I told a traumatic story, and it was at this diversity council, amazingly. And the black man looks at me and he goes, I have a question. And then I said, no. I want you to tell me how you felt about what I just shared with you. And I said, you know how much energy it takes for me as an Asian man to tell you this culturally? Because we don't do this, not in public. And it could cost me this contract on top of that. Then he goes, okay. There was a lot of emotion and a lot of hurt when you shared. And then I said, yes, but you still aren't being specific. And he looked at me quizzically, and I said, if you told me about what George Floyd, how it affected you both before the verdict and after, and I just simply, I could see a lot came up for you, would you feel satisfied with that? And I said, the truth of it really is you're doing to me what white people do to me all the time, is that they don't ask me and tell me that they're moved and touched and ask me questions so I could go deeper and what that means to me. That's what Victor was longing. That's what you saw toward the end of the film, didn't you?
Connection.
He must be telling the truth. And by the way, it wasn't Victor who convinced him. I had another white guy go outside in the swimming pool and talk to him. It took another white man to tell him, I know what you're talking about.
Yeah.
So that's sad too, isn't it? That he wouldn't believe what Victor said until another white man stepped forward.
Yeah. Yeah, I really enjoy it. And the man you're referencing is Gordon, correct?
Yeah.
I really, really appreciated Gordon's input because he was clearly at an intersection with his process of understanding his racism.
But you know how much he had to be prompted to do that.
Yeah.
And by the way, he was chosen because he was in those men's groups that I was in. And oftentimes when I brought it up and I got attacked, he would meet me at the end of the meeting and goes, that was horrible the way they treated you. That's why I put him in the film, because he's so common to me. Why didn't he say something? Why didn't he stand up for me? But then along with that is that he appears to be this good white guy, but I wanted him to go more into his own doubts, his own racism, just like I wanted to do with Tim Wise. Tim, tell me about your own racism. And one of the things I was just telling people recently with Tim Wise is that he speaks for a lot of white people about whiteness. But I noticed that every time someone asks him a question, he answers it. and he answers it all out very deeply. And what I've always noticed is, how come he never asked them any questions? Like, tell me why you asked that. Tell me what came up for you. And so I think for me, it's that, and is he the perfect white guy? And so it becomes unbelievable that's why when I share with you, tell me about yourself, because it isn't about those white people over there or even just David over here. It's the part that is, where did he get all these questions that you hear all over the country? Exactly the same ones, again and again, generation after generation. It's because that's how they're deeply embedded they are in the dialogue around diversity.
Well, I've got more questions that I know we're not going to get to in time, but I also don't want to duck or dodge anything that might still be open and alive in you that you want to investigate in me. Have I shown you, shared with you?
So I want to ask you a very point blank question: are you afraid of black folks?
Yes.
Good. And what about them that you're afraid of?
I don't understand. I don't understand them, their culture, and moving to America. It was new to me.
So when I ask you what you're afraid about black people, are you afraid they might hurt you?
Anger.
Mm-hmm. Good. When you see black people, do you wonder if they're educated, civilized?
Yes.
Okay, good. Do you wonder, oh, they must be poor, living on welfare?
Yeah.
Yeah. And then how does that affect how you see them, huh?
It's glasses.
Yeah. One of my recent girlfriends, I live in a fairly poor neighborhood, and she saw 6 black men sitting on their porch. And she said, look at them. Well, they're not even working. And I said, and they're just smoking. And I just said, well, what if they were 6 white guys? Would you have said that? And she was just step back. It's like, oh, that's different. Or what if they were 6 Asian people sitting there? And so when we take that, so I appreciate your honesty. And then where do you think you learned those things about blacks?
Nature, nurture, my upbringing, the movies,
So
television.
Not only what you heard and saw, but I'd like to propose that racism also gets created by what you don't see. You don't see them as presidents until more recently. You don't see them winning the Academy Awards until recently. You don't see them on programs. You don't see them in a family portrayal of a long series of a family until last year, because of the epidemic that we have suddenly them on Netflix. But that was just last year. And then along with that is that you didn't see them as heroes. You didn't see them as inventors, except one or two that you would pop up for soap and you had to do a quiz. You definitely didn't probably date them, so you didn't really necessarily have personal friendships with people of color to ask them about racism. Unless people stood up and told their own stories, we more than likely didn't ask. And so it got perpetuated. And then, like my father said, he never met a college educated black man, so he assumed that they were all on welfare, on drugs, etc. So until you actually interface with them, those mythologies keep getting passed on. And perhaps maybe even if I haven't asked you today, we might not have ever said this out loud. Yeah. What is your fear if you did say these things out loud, that you carried these?
Yeah, that my character would be thrown into question, that I'd be seen as a racist.
Yeah.
And that it would cut the deep, true desires that I have to connect with people that are different from me. And that's what I want. That's what I wish for. I may not get it, but that's something that I want to be a champion for change with. And that what I've just shared is going to not make that possible.
Yeah. I think one of the things that came up in our recent interviews was that from white people was that I have an image of myself, which I like to keep, which is I'm loving, caring, compassionate, open to all people, etc., which is what David tried to portray early on in the film, and then later on revealed how he saw people. And I think that why I had you, what's the value of you doing this, is that I don't think you're alone. I think if you were to ask a whole lot of the white folks and white men at that Mankind Project, you might be surprised how many are also feeling that same way, but are scared to have that dialogue and to share that. And so hence you hide that by saying, I'm just here to listen. I just want you people of color to do all the talking.
Yeah.
You see, because see, the problem is that
it's not, it's racism is a white problem, right?
Right. Well, it's not just a white problem. I think that it's become a problem for all of us now, because, you know, I lose when you don't talk, and you lose when I do all the talking, so that we don't really have an exchange. You see, the reason why people of color said that is because they felt like they were cut off. They felt like white people took over the conversation. They invalid and true, but it didn't mean that you just go hide and that's it. You just listen. Like someone said, I wanted to say something, but I wanted to give you all the time. And then, so what happens after diversity workshops is that people of color often say, well, where were the white people? Where were their voices? And that's part of that mythology. And someone said, well, what if I do get in a conflict? What if I say something that offends you? And I said, let's get this over with. We've had 500 years of don't ask, don't tell. The odds of you offending me are excellent. However, if you know that your possibilities are really good, is that going to make you avoid the conversation? Or if we do have conflict, let's work it out. Let's talk about it.
Yeah.
Some of our best conversations and best relationships were built on people that we endured and worked through on conflict. Why is it that when it comes to diversity, we become so adverse to the idea that conflict is unresolvable? Yet we have every imaginable friend that we've ever had that we've had conflict, and we didn't start it off with going, if you offend me or I offend you, then the relationship's over with. Part of the commitment that really was important was you and I are going to talk and work this thing out. That part was important. And I think that that's where we still are today. And that's why you and I created this groundwork, foundation to talk to each other so that we really could connect with each other. And part of it had to do with not talking about what we had in common, but talking about those gray areas, wasn't it, Brandon? And also, wasn't just simply, I would love it all of us come together, but I'm scared to have that happen. I'm scared those gray, dark shadows that we carry. I have them of tons of you. I mean, as a white person, that I have to break through. You have tons of them about me as a Chinese American man, a mythology that you may have, you know, and I'm not mystical, you know, and I'm not constantly in meditation, and I don't walk around, you know, with all my ancestors in my head and, you know, rise above the ground. I'm human, just like anybody else is. I may have done diversity work for 34 years and taught and all this, but I'm just as much as human as anybody else. I hurt people. I say things. I'm sexist. I have to overcome my homophobic, racist, sexist indoctrination daily. And as I watch my language, my thoughts. And so just because I'm a person of color, I'm not perfect. But it's that imperfect conversation that I want. Yes.
Messy.
The willingness.
Messy.
So that out of the messiness comes this beautiful grace where we mix it in together as brothers, you know. And that word brothers doesn't come lightly to me. Just because we're both males doesn't make us brothers. Like I said to somebody, I said, I don't even know you. You're going to have to earn it. And I'm going to have to earn it with you. And we're going to have to mix it up to get to know each other.
That feels like that intersection between willingness versus wantingness, right? Because like I want what I feel to be my true character to be seen and on display. But am I willing to do the work to make that truly integral to
exactly
not just the image, but is it backed up by the work?
Yeah, exactly.
Doing the work, the messy
exactly
stuff.
It's like Tyler Perry said at the Oscars, which infuriated everyone. He says, I want you to love the cops. But what he didn't emphasize, it wasn't that I don't think that cops are lovable, but I wanted him to be angry at the injustice and injustice by the police, injustice by these white supremacists, because otherwise it forces me to skip over. And I know he's been indoctrinated to not go deeper. I wanted to read you something because I thought it was really important. Because I recently wrote a thing called "Say Something America," and I wanted to read it to you because I think it's really relevant, but it's something that I wanted to say to Tyler Perry, who said that just love police officers. My mom told me to love everybody, but I think that there's a way in which that avoids standing up. Recently, I was watching We Are the Dream Kids. It was called We Are the Dream Kids, and it was a program in which a young Muslim girl shares as she competes. A young Muslim girl shares a story in which she goes to a beach wearing her hijab with her mother, and one of the people at the beach yells out, "Watch out! Those are bombers!" And the interviewer is listening to this and just absolutely shocked, and so that must have been so horrible. And what the Muslim girl says, "No, we hear this all the time." What really hurt was that nobody said anything. And I just recently heard that from this skater who was Korean and was also being attacked verbally. And she said, that's not just what hurt me. It was that all these witnesses didn't say a word. And same thing with that Asian woman who was beaten on the ground. And there was something that that I wrote is that her words kept resonating all day in my ears and heart. No one said anything. How coincidental that today is also Dr. Martin Luther King's birthday. And there was a documentary on his life. As I watched the footage of their 60s marches through Selma and Montgomery, there were all these huge crowds of white folks, men and women and children of all ages with Confederate flags, yelling the N-word and throwing things and spitting on them at these frightened but brave marchers in the film. One woman even spit in Dr. Martin Luther King's face. I was appalled at such a cowardly act of hatred. And then with great sadness, I realized how those same looks are the very same ones I still see today. The fierce anguish on their faces reminded me of the recent January 6th white supremacist terrorist attack on the Capitol. The hatred and violence is still here in 2021, and the silence of those who say nothing are just as deafening as it was back then. So then what can be done to break the silence? Perhaps the words of a young Black man, Amutabi Hines, best expresses what is needed. One time I visited a maximum security prison in Salem, and the first person I met was a Black man in an orange jumpsuit sweeping, who with exuberance and a big smile said to me, "How you doing, brother?" This happened over and over again as I made my way through the prison. In a strange way, it was the first and only time I felt like part of the critical mass anywhere in the whole state of Oregon, and felt where I could even feel the semblance of safety and care. But I know that without justice, without equity, without honoring diversity and truly including us in the sharing of power, there will be no peace for anyone. You and your descendants will not know true peace and hope and happiness as long as there are systems that subjugate, enslave, and terrorize. Then those that terrorize are allowed to survive and thrive in this country and institutions. That is a promise. And so if you want to do something to end racism, stop the suffering of a crisis of imagination, a crisis of listening, a crisis of possibility, and meet me as someone who wants to have a fully expressed say. Meet me as the possibility of who I am. And I think that today that's what I wanted between the two of us. is for you to see the possibility of who I am can only be fully realized if you're willing to equally share with me, not just my traumatic stories, but your stereotypes, your hesitations, your fears. And then realize how we have both lost. As I said in my last film, we both have lost a part of ourselves. And we both need each other if we're to find our way back together again as a nation, as a community, and as friends. Well, we have to realize what we've lost, what part we play, and how we need each other to come back together again.
What means the most to me right now is that my fear and my discomfort throughout this conversation, it feels validated, but not remedied, not from a place of rescue me from this feeling, rescue me from this elephant in the room that I don't want to deal with right now. And I just love the transformation with David in the film, knowing that there was plenty of work still to do on his journey and his process, but just the wake-up call for him to go, wow, I can't just run away and numb this feeling right now. And it's not anyone else's job in the room to make me, the white person, feel better and to stop these emotions that are coming up, but to actually sit with it, to move through it. That's a big part of the work.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Definitely. Thank you.
So we're just at time, Mun Wah. So I want to ask you, for me and the Davids of the world, right, that are willing, maybe not wanting all the time, but are willing to be assets for change. What's the first step? What's the continued work?
Yeah.
And
So I'd like to take what you just said. For me and all those like David who are willing to take the steps, is I would like you to work with those whites who are unwilling to take that step. You see, you can hang out with me and it'd be cool, but that's the easy step. The hard step is the ones to step forward and have the conversations. Let's sit down. Let's talk about racism. Let's sit down and talk about what's hard about it. Let's sit down and let's talk about what came up for you with the violence that you see toward these folks. What's scary, what's hard. And I want to share with you what's scary and hard for me. And then hopefully our goal is what we can do. And if you really want to know what change looks like for people of color, you can go up and ask them, in what way could I help? So when I put this challenge out to you, it'll be hopefully that the next time you and I talk, you will have actually actualized it and actually do something about it. Because you have the convenience of knowing that you don't have to really talk about this or deal with it, and you're not going to lose a part of your life at all. What I live with every day is that if we don't talk about it, if I don't get you to talk about it, if I don't get this world to change, my son's life is in danger, and so is mine. And it's like climate change. It won't go away just because we'd like it to go away or we don't believe that it's here. It will affect all of us. And so, like someone once said, when I see your film and why, it's just so incredibly moving. And then what I say to people is, there are some people in this room who are seeing my film. It is the story of their families and their grandfathers. And when they leave here, it will still be the story of their children and their grandparents and their children. And that's why it has to stop. I remember something my father used to say to me. He says, I want a better world for you. That's why I work so hard. And what I realized is what he was trying to say is that he won't see that better world in his lifetime. And I don't want to say that to my son. I want to see it in my lifetime. And so I don't want to be waiting for the next generation. I want to see it now. That's why can you imagine? I mean, here I want to go to the Mankind Project to talk in front of probably 95% white men to talk about racism. Really? I do it because I need their help. I need you to change the world.
It's a call to action.
I need you to have the conversations. And so I will come. I will come anywhere to begin this conversation, however dangerous, however difficult. Like I said to somebody else, they said, I want to be a diversity trainer. I said, you're talking about wanting to walk into rooms constantly all over this country, in the South, in the North, in the West, in the Midwest, to talk one of the most dangerous, most difficult topics in this country called racism. And you just want to do it as a profession, it's going to be one of the most difficult journeys of your life. And if people read my books, they get to see what kind of situations I had to face. Luckily, I came out alive sometimes, but how scared I was to walk into some rooms, all rooms that I walked into, because here I am, a Chinese American man, unsure of how I'd be received, devastated by racism generationally, constantly having people who have stares and hearing now the anti-Asian violence. Do you know what it feels like now to walk down the street so vigilant and angry and scared that someone could just punch me in the head or knock me in the back of my head in the ground and start kicking me until I'm in a coma? Or what's it like to go on to BART or, public transportation? As recently, an Asian man was literally choked till he was unconscious and no one did anything to stop him. And that is the fear. And then some have died. Some are permanently damaged physically, but the damage is far more. It's emotional. It's traumatic. See, George Floyd is only one verdict from 1,000. 3 more were killed right after and then every day there's been one, even today, even yesterday. And it goes on in ridiculous situations. And you wonder. And then also when you think on compounding that is, when was the last time you heard about the migrant children? Yeah. When was the last time you heard about all the American women who have been disappearing? Hundreds of them. I don't remember a single article until the new head of the Department of the Interior brought it up. And one of my American Indian friends did. Otherwise, I wouldn't have seen it in the news. And so you wouldn't even know the statistics about how many thousands of anti-Asian violence until you saw the statistics in the newspaper because something just happened.
Yeah.
And so I often tell people, go ask those people, how can I help? And don't think it's either one or the other. You'll work on yourself and you'll also ask what I can do more to help. And that's the hard work.
What comes alive in me when I hear you say that is, it's one thing to be moved, but it's another thing to go and move.
Right. Into those communities. It's easy to work with willing white men, but then work with the unwilling, angry, white supremacists. What would that be like? To continue that conversation and keep it going. Yeah.
To invite them into the dialogue, like, let's grow together. Like, because I'm going to be a mirror for you and you're going to be a mirror for me. Like, let's grow together in this.
Well, it may also begin with that it's going to be hard, that you may be facing each other in a protest, and then stay with it. And I think that also is confronting it. You see, I think that that's exactly how change occurs. Look at the persistence of Martin Luther King had, the persistence of so many movements in this country. Gandhi, he didn't go away. He didn't back down. He just kept going. And that's what I want to see people having, is that I want the bravery I think there's a guy named Matthew McConaughey or something like this, and he just said, "Well, I just want to hear both side stories." And what I wanted to say is, "No, Matthew, I want to see you in the protest lines. I want to see you standing up. I want you to earn your stripes before I trust you. I want to see you confronting the voter suppression in Texas." Did you know that a school just came out and said you cannot come and teach if you were vaccinated? I want you to get angry with that. I want you to say that's wrong. It puts my child in danger. And then imagine that the voters, we're going to make sure that the toll boxes, the boxes where you put your ballot in, you have to go 100 miles to put it in. There's something wrong with that. Yeah. And that's in Texas, and that's in Florida, and that's in Georgia. And so what happens is do that and stand up, because it's really great for you as a white man just to have a dialogue with another white guy and then just say, well, both sides need to talk. No, what we need to do is to do both, to stand up to the injustice and call it for what it is. And sure, I work on people having dialogues, but I don't mince any words when I say that's wrong. And I don't care whether you're a Democrat or you're a Republican. I would say that's wrong, what you're doing. And that's important to me. Yeah. And that's the hard part. That's the important part. Yeah. Just like what you did today when we crossed paths today with each other. Yeah.
I love how you put it, walking each other home. And,
yes,
and
exactly.
I felt like you
did.
Yeah, I felt that. So my journey has just begun on my place in the world and place in these topics and issues. And I really feel that call to action, call to attention around it. So I hope that those of you watching live right now feel the same. Of course, each of our journeys are going to be different in many ways, of course. But yeah, I feel a lot of feels right now. And I know there's a lot of integration that's going to need to happen to inform the path forward. So with that, I want to thank you for being here. Mun Wah. I really want to thank you, mate. This has been incredibly challenging, but also very rewarding. And yeah, mate, I'm just full of all the feels right now. Is there one last thing I want to ask you is both what brings you hope and what is it that you want to leave the listeners with before we sign off?
Well, I think moments like this give me hope. Almost every workshop I feel like I go and do, it gives me hope. I think that I don't necessarily think I could ever instigate institutionalized change, but we have to do it with people around us and begin the difficult conversations. And I think it's persistence. I hope that for this country that you never stop crying when you hear someone being killed, murdered, abused, demeaned. And I hope that you step forward as if it were your own child. I think that every day people are longing to have more hope. Do you realize with all the evidence against the man who put his knee on George Floyd, that even with all that evidence, people were so scared that justice wasn't going to be done? And that tells you a lot. That how many people still believed he was innocent. And by the way, I didn't hear one single word from the former president. And so that's important. Our one Republican senator, our congressperson saying something. So what gives me hope is then in the people to remember that there are good people that are working on this every day, however imperfect. And it's one day, like Martin Luther King said, I may not get to the mountaintop with you, but it will happen. And I do believe very strongly that there will be justice. It is the only antidote to this country. There is no shortcut to it. I think one philosopher once said that America would not be destroyed from an outside enemy, but from within. And I think it's already happening. We came very close, and it could still happen. So it means that we have to stand up and be counted every single day. We have to decide to meet new people and stand up for them, because you never know, one day when you stand up, it might be someone else's child. And when you model that, someday it might be someone who stands up for your child. And I think that's exactly what it is. One person helping another. It has always been that. I remembered when the American Indians met the settlers, they asked us three things: take care of the land, share what you have, and take good care of each other. Wow, how simple, and how much we didn't listen to them. And it is still there. As Amitavi said, a crisis of possibility. See that as a possibility still. Take care of the land, share what you have, and take good care of each other. I think that is still, what a beautiful thing to say. And that would give me great hope if one generation after another practices that every day.
Beautiful, Mun Wah. Beautiful.
Thank you.
Well, mate, that's about all the time we have, and what a beautiful time it has been spending this with you. And
thank you so
not
much.
only do I want to thank you, I want to thank all of you that joined us live. I see your comments. I see your courage to share. And I want to thank you again for joining us for another live recording of the Mankind Podcast, the show where we break the molds of modern manhood and other things to prove that there's more than just one way to be a man and more than just one way to be human. Thank you, Mun Wah, and thank you guys that have joined us live. This has been the Mankind Podcast, produced in association with the Mankind Project USA. I have been your host, Brandon Clift, and I personally want to thank our guests for joining us today and imparting their wisdom from their experiences in this amazing journey called life. And of course, I want to thank you, the listener, because through your attention and your support, you make it a heck of a lot easier for us to let men out there in the world know that they are not alone and that there is more than one way to be a man. Special thanks, of course, goes to my incredible team, Marketing and Communications Director Boyson Hodgson, producer and editor of this episode, Michael Russo, who makes me sound so much more intelligent than I actually am, so of course, special kudos goes there. And if you've been enjoying the music throughout this episode and all of our episodes, check out Jim, Donovan, and the Sun King Warriors. I have links to them in the show notes. Now, the fee for this episode is simple. If you found gold and insights that you believe could benefit your loved ones and those you care about, be sure to share it with them. And of course, remember that life doesn't happen to us, it happens for us, so long as we rip the pen out of fate's hand and become the author of our own story. So my friend, pick up the pen and we'll see you next week. Lots of love.